Welcome, everyone, to our NCAA Social Series. This is episode 60. I'm Andy Katz. Pleased to be joined by Shane Lyons, who in his day job is the athletic director at West Virginia, but also wears many hats. He is in charge of the football oversight committee for Division I, and soon will be the Division I Council chair, which of course takes on even more responsibility, Shane. So there's going to be a lot of basically items on your plate going forward in this year, if last year wasn't busy enough between all your jobs. So first, you were last on last summer in the middle of the pandemic as we were trying to think, could we even have a fall football season? And at that point, we didn't know if everyone could participate. If some, we of course later learned that the Pac-12 and Big Ten decided later in the year or in the summer to get on board. And we had a season, although with many disruptions. So from then to now, just overall first, where do you think we are in terms of how far we've come with preparing for football?
Well, I think we've come a long way, Andy. I mean, as you mentioned, last July, we had some long conversations about, if we could have a season and what that season would look like. And as you mentioned, a couple conferences decided that they weren't going to play, and the three other Power Five conferences ultimately decided we're going to play. It was a little bit of a delayed start, knowing there could be disruptions through there. And I think you're right. There were disruptions. But, overall, you had about 85% of the games actually being completed. So if you told me last July we would have gotten through the football season with 85% of the games being played that were actually on the schedule, the other two conferences decided playing later on, got through a basketball season really about the same way, had some disruptions along the way, had a very unique Final Four, with everybody being in kind of the bubble atmosphere. And then you got through all your fall sports, all your spring sports. Some of your spring sports obviously played championships. So across the board, specifically in football, I consider success, working through a pandemic. And, a lot of credit goes to our membership. And, first and foremost, as we talked last year, was about the health and safety of our student athletes. And we put the right protocols in place to make sure that happened, that there was testing, there were testing for cardiac issues if a student athlete did test positive for the virus. So there was a lot of things in place, and we got through it, and something we should be very proud of.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, everyone from every level to pull this off. And one other thing before we dive deep into what's going forward here, I'm just curious from an athletic director's point of view, what was that like when you had to basically, be, just holding on, you were stressed every time you got those test results back, or your opponent, and not knowing if a game was going to be played, or if you had to make that call that a game could not be played because of COVID issues? What was that anxiety stress level like?
Yeah, it was high each week, Andy. That's for sure. We tested on Sundays, then on Wednesdays, and then Friday mornings. So really, you started seeing set on that Sunday test, and if you could get through that, I kind of found that you were probably in pretty good shape. And then, obviously the Wednesday test rolled around, and then Friday morning before, at least in the Big 12, before we got on the plane to travel, or another Big 12 team was coming to us, we would have those test results in by noon. So there was a lot of phone calls with other athletic directors, Andy, during the week to say, where are you all at? What does it look like? We got through a full season. Unfortunately, we got late in the middle of December, had a makeup game against Oklahoma. The initial game, they had issues with their program for our Thanksgiving weekend game. And then 2 weeks later, we got through all the way through the season. And then ultimately that makeup game, it caught up with us. So it was stressful, throughout. I will say that, and a lot of the public doesn't know this, just from West Virginia's perspective, and I can say this is probably very similar to other Power Five schools. As of probably last week, we had given over 36,000 tests just within the athletic department of our student athletes. So that shows you the sacrifices our student athletes, our coaches, staff, everybody put in with that many tests going throughout the season. So needless to say, it was a stressful season, but we have light at the end of the tunnel now, and we look forward to a new way post pandemic and what this is going to look like and in the future months.
All right, so let's talk about that. A year ago at this time, well, not now, there weren't anyone on campus, but once players got to campus, weight rooms were outside. They were very, fragmented as who could work out. I mean, now I'm seeing on social media, everyone's working out. They are in the same facility. I would argue the majority of these athletes probably pictured are vaccinated. And so the rules have changed. But what are the preseason practice recommendations, suggestions? Where are we in terms of prohibited drills? What's the summer going to look like?
Yeah, we started a full study as the Oversight Committee, back in February, March time frame. And what that was about, it was a couple things, Andy. It was about what does recruiting look like if we get back to it, which we have. We lifted the recruiting ban on June 1st, and what that's going to look like in the summer and through the fall. Then we also, decided to look at the total preseason practice in August, what that's going to look like. And there was some, studies that were done on concussions and head trauma and contact. And we felt it was necessary to take immediate action, to try to curb some of those test results that had shown that there were more concussions in the actual preseason than there were during the actual season itself. So as football oversight chair, I asked two subgroups to meet and talk about the recruiting aspect, and another group to talk more about the preseason. And ultimately where we got was that one, is the recruiting had opened back up. We were allowing some on-campus evaluations, which we've never allowed before in football. And then some things happening in the fall with a few extra evaluations during that time period. And then we felt we had a little bit more time and runway to look at the future of the recruiting. From the concussion, standpoint, we looked at last year, we allowed some activities with our student athletes, with the coaches, and using, walkthroughs, different things. We went back to the old rule, Andy, and felt like this summer that was not necessarily what we wanted to do in the summer. So the focus got into August and said, what are we going to do in August once the student athletes report? So they can do their summer 8 weeks of workouts, but nothing through walkthroughs and all that. Then we started looking at the preseason, and we felt that there had to be some limitations that we put. We extended the acclimatization period from 5 days to 7 days. So that helps with helmets, and spider pads are now currently allowed. We also limited the number of contacts, full contacts, bringing to the ground, tackling to 9, and then other contacts that are not taking the student athlete to the ground, full tackling to 9, practice opportunities. And that gets your 25 practice opportunities that each institution has. With that also, we looked at prohibited drills, as you talked about. And it was important to us to look to say, what are actually football drills, and not drills that just test the strength or, the hype and all that. So you look at drills that were direct, in-line contact, and we call those, direct line contacts. And we felt that those weren't necessary. So some of the names that we've all heard, the Oklahoma drill, the bull in the ring, drills. And we looked at that and said, that's not necessary. That's really not, it is football, but it's not football in the sense of teaching blocking drills, teaching tackling drills, teaching other things. We felt that those were just unnecessary drills that, had potential head impacts associated with them. So that's where we came up, and that's just not preseason. The prohibited drills, Andy, are throughout the entire football season. That would be the in season, preseason, in season, and in the spring. And we felt that was necessary. And we had great response. And I know it was a long answer to your question here, but this was just not the Football Oversight Committee. This was collaboration among the American Football Coaches Association, the Committee on Medical Safeguards and Aspects. There was a large number of people and different groups coming together to put this proposal together, which was ultimately adopted by the council. So, we feel very good of where we landed. But that doesn't mean that it's that we're at the end. That means that we're going to continue studying this and looking at the future as well for future preseasons.
What did you hear from the student athletes?
Pretty much the same thing. I failed to mention. I mean, they were part of our committee. They were part of the group. We have a couple different student athletes that's actually on the committee, but we also have the Student Athlete Connection Group that's ran by one of the student athletes. And they take that back to a group, and the participation's anywhere from 10 to 20 student athletes, and they took that back, not only the prohibited drills, but the whole model itself. And there was a lot of positive feedback from our student athletes of saying, this is the way the practices should be, conducted. I will share that, when we initially came back, we had less number of contacts that we did. We had, it turned out, when I say a 7-9-9 model, 7 in the acclimatization period, and then 8 or 9 in non or contact but not full contact, and then 9 full contact practices. And so the student athletes initially, we had I believe it was an 8 or a 7-7 model or something like that. And we actually increased that after talking to student athletes, of saying, we feel there needs to be another, a practice, or as an 8-8 model. We need to have an additional contact, practice in there. So there was a lot of, again, collaboration among student athletes and our medical folks, and again, along with coaches in the committee itself. So, that's where we ultimately came up with the model, and the student athletes, one, like the removal of the prohibited drills, but then also felt there needed to be, more opportunities for teaching and tackling, in that practice. So we'll see where it goes. As you mentioned, the studies, will continue. It's not just a 1-year study. We've been doing these studies for 5 years. We'll continue to study it and see, what the numbers look like in the future as well.
So Shane, a year ago when we talked, there was a lot of discussion about, how many weeks a team needs to prepare for a season. Was it 4? Was it 6? And it allowed you guys to really address, sort of where you're at with the sport. And I'm curious, from that, and then also recruiting, especially with the use of Zoom, what have you guys been able to take from that self-study that was necessary just to get the product on the field that you think will stay in a post-pandemic world after sort of really diving down on what is really needed?
Well, I think, what we have right now, Andy, I think is people feel it's really needed. And that's the 25 practices that we currently have. Some had argued that, is it less, is it more? And, the number kept coming back to kind of where we are right now. Now, there are discussions that, we have 20, you can currently right now, you count 29 days back from your first competition. And then obviously you have to have a day off a week. So you come out with 25 practices. You'll find some coaches use all 25 practices. You'll find also some coaches only use 21 of the 25 or 23 of the 25. So, we're right there in that neighborhood. I think increasing that is not the right thing to do. Decreasing it is probably, also not the right thing to do. So I think we're in that happy medium. Now, there are some conferences that had proposed, and it did not gain a lot of traction, but there was conferences proposing that to 29 days be increased to 35 days and then have more days off during the preseason. Now, what that does is push back your start date. Instead of roughly, I'm going to use an estimate here, that you're starting the first week in August, it may be the last week of July. some of our student athletes, have problems with that of saying, great, I get a couple days off a week during preseason, and that just extends it. It cuts into my summertime, even though we have, a few days off. So there was not a whole lot of support initially for that. That doesn't mean that we won't continue to look at that and study it, Andy. But I think the student athletes felt like, I want to get into preseason and get started. And yeah, one day off a week is necessary, but having 2 and sometimes 3 days a week and extending camp that much longer, camp even at 29 days gets to be pretty long. So I think if you're looking at 35, there would be concern with that. But that doesn't mean that the committee won't continue to study this and look at it in future months. From recruiting,
the aspect, I was just going to say that also as an athletic director, you can't tell me that it doesn't save money, at least on the front end, when you're trying to determine, okay, do I really want to recruit this individual, or do they want me to maybe do it in this forum? You could Zoom with the parents, the coach, the workout guy, you name it, to get to know this person and get a feel of both sides before maybe even fly them in or you fly out. So there's also a cost in an advantage of using this technology.
Yeah, and you just touched on it. We haven't, totally, and again, this is the work of the committee, in future months, because we really didn't have the time to really evaluate it. But what my charge has been, and as you mentioned, we'll talk about later, I'm sure that, I'm going off as chair of the football oversight committee and becoming chair of the council. But, one of the charges that, will continue to be, placed on the oversight committee is looking at the total recruiting calendar and what we've learned, through the pandemic and what worked and what didn't work. And, I think some of the things that have worked is, technology. You just said, we've allowed unlimited contact more or less with the student athlete, with the parents. So there was a lot of conversations. It used to be the phone call. Now we're having face-to-face conversations. And they felt they got to know, from at least my coaches and talking to them, they felt that they got to know the student athlete better because of having these, Zoom calls and meeting the family and having more interaction with them face-to-face, through these type of technologies. What we have to look at, is it necessary to have the number of home visits? Is it necessary to be going into the high schools as much as we were? So there's a little bit of a life work balance here from the coaches. And sometimes as administrators, we always joke and say this, we got to save the coaches from themselves. Yeah. Because, they want to go. And as administrators, as you say, there's a cost element to this to say, is this really necessary? Do we need to be flying coaches all around the country for a 20-minute meeting in their house when you could have a 20-minute meeting on Zoom? Really, what is the difference other than sitting in the living room and initially having that? So the charge of the group will be to look at the full recruiting calendar and take what we've learned and say, how do we cut this down? And I think the thing that's important, this is just not going to be the committee by itself. It is going to be the collaboration, working with the AFCA and others, to make sure that we, try to come up with a model that works for everyone.
Well, and there's no question the coaches certainly can do both. They can have a Zoom with a recruit and then have practice. A lot of times, if they go travel to the recruit, there's no practice that day, or at least they're not at practice that day. And so, this alleviates that. One last thing, football related, is targeting. The continued emphasis on targeting. Where do we stand?
Yeah, the rules committee continues to evaluate this year in and year out. It's one rule that I believe is actually, totally necessary. I believe it's working. There is subjectivity, in the rule. We've gotten to the point where, the play is actually, replayed in the booths, and people look at it and make a determination whether it's targeting or not targeting. We did last year remove the penalty where the student athlete has to leave the field of play and go to the locker room. I would say I was a little bit concerned about that, what that was going to mean but actually it's worked out very well. The student athlete obviously removed the helmet. You don't let the young man back in the game, but they can still be there for their teammates, and that has worked. But the rule itself, Andy, in it's controversial, and needless to say, because you have subjectivity to it. But when you watch, and again, what we're trying to do is protect the student athlete, protect the game itself from a safety standpoint, and try to teach young men the proper tackling techniques. And sometimes, in slow motion, it is, very obvious, but game speed, it's pretty quick. But, I think that, for the most part, we got it right. And you see, less number of targeting issues that from when we started. You see the student athlete, there were, as we called it, there were some student athletes that were headhunters out there. And, you've seen that number drop, of the number, like, a student athlete, I think in 1 year had over, 5 or 6, targeting calls against that one individual. That's dropped dramatically as well, because they know they're not going to play the full game or miss, part of the next game. So, that's something that we'll continue to study. But, do I think it's going to be, a rule change to go back and not have it as part of the rules? I don't think so. I think the rules committee will continue to try to look at that, as well as other safety rule aspects to make the game as safe as possible.
And actually one last thing I just want to bring up is that, and we talked about this with Brian Hainline last week, the NCAA chief medical officer. We're still not obviously 100% fully vaxxed. We'll never be 100% fully vaxxed. But what happens in scenarios where you have teams, regardless of sport, where not every player is vaccinated, in terms of testing of the non-vaccinated, and how you deal with, if you have a football team and you got 60 players and 40 are fully vaxxed, 20 are not? How do you deal with teams like that where you're going to have that dynamic potentially in different numbers?
Yeah, and again, that's the issues that we're facing. Do I have the answers today? The answer is no, Andy, I don't. But as we go in, I'm proud to say that a number of our student athletes at West Virginia are vaccinated, and we're over that 70% mark in several of our teams, and hopefully over the summer we'll get that in some of the other teams as well. So you kind of build that herd immunity. Now, who do you continue to test? Obviously the CDC requirements are saying if you're vaccinated and you're around somebody that is positive, that you don't have to go into quarantine. That was kind of probably the most motivation that we had for student athletes to get vaccinated, because they don't like to be in isolation for 14 days and go through the other testing protocols. So they were incentivized by that, saying, "Hey, I'm going to get the vaccine, so I don't have to go into quarantines." So those who are not, that's still the question that's out there. Do we test them? Are you still put into quarantine, and how long that's going to be, and so on. So I think we have another couple months as we approach the fall season to continue working through that. But to say I have the answer today, that I don't. We're working through those issues with our medical folks, not only nationally with Dr. Hainline's group, but also within the conference, saying what are the protocols going to be and what's that going to look like.
All right, so I just want to shift. You mentioned it. I said at the top that you're going to be the, taking on this role as the chair of the Division I Council. What do you see your role, with that kind of responsibility?
Well, again, I'm very honored and humbled to serve in that role, and take great pride in the work that the council and the NCAA does from a legislative standpoint. I do think there's still a number of issues the NCAA is facing, and hopefully before my chair begins on July 1, we'll get the name, image, likeness, proposals off the table and adopted, and start implementing that, before that July 1st date, and what that's going to look like, and how that's going to impact institutions. So Grace Calhoun has done a great job of steering the ship here as we went through some very turbulent times with the pandemic and the number of issues that we dealt with, the transfers. So, but there's still a lot of issues that, constantly the NCAA and the, faces day in and day out. But, I'm going to, obviously take the role and try to lead the membership and through the bureaucracies that we have. And again, I think sometimes we're criticized as we talk that, are there things through the bureaucracy? Sometimes, the NCAA is criticized for saying that it takes too long to make movement. And we've shown during this pandemic that we can do that. We have the flexibility. We can move faster in some situations than we have in the past. So, we'll have to monitor that and look at issues and say, are these issues that need immediate change, or do they go through the normal legislative process? So, we'll continue to work through those items and work with the NCAA staff and the membership to try to make college athletics the best that we can.
Well, Shane, I think it'll be in good hands with you as the head of the Division I Council. Maybe you can use a little influence with the Hall of Fame to get Bob Huggins in there as well, just so you get more power. But anyway, I digress. So first of all, let's hope for a successful and safe summer as we hope for full stadiums and full participation in the fall in all sports. So this will conclude our NCAA Social Series, episode number 60. As always, you can go to ncaa.org/social series, where all of them are archived. Shane Lyons, the athletic director at West Virginia, the chair of the Division I Oversight Committee, outgoing, now incoming Division I Council chair. Appreciate your time. As everyone, stay safe out there, and we'll talk.